Hi everyone and welcome back. This is the second video in our series, and last time we talked about the predecessor to the violin, the viol, and the Renaissance. So let's get to it. Now, I'd like to come back to what I had mentioned in the last video. You might have noticed that early violins, as opposed to viols, still look slightly different to our modern ones. A great example of a standard Baroque setup would be to look at the videos from the Netherlands Bach Society. I like to watch Bach's violin concertos with Shunsuke Sato leading the ensemble. Not only is Sato one of my favorite violinists right now, but the whole ensemble is fantastic. And again, this is a Baroque setup, and we've moved fully away from the Renaissance, so we're talking late 1600s into the mid 1700s. Now, the first thing to look at in videos like the Bach Societies is the bows that they used. They're totally different. The stick itself is much more rounded at the top than what we're used to, and there is no mechanism, or at least not much of one, at the bottom. Up until around the end of the 18th century, there was no standardization when it came to bows. The craft was almost completely focused on the range of shape and design. In short, what was the most aesthetically pleasing. Baroque bows were much shorter. The hair of the bow would yield a lot more against the string, so it would feel kind of squishy against the string, if that makes sense. And the actual width of the hair ribbon would be around 6 millimeters as opposed to the 12 millimeters that we use today. So we're looking at a bow that was much weaker, had little in the way of sostenuto or sustain, and was really meant for lighter ensemble playing. By the end of the 18th century, we're starting to look at the classical bow, the transitional bow. So by this time, the music was starting to change as well. There was more demand for violin solos, and the instrument had to become more assertive to be able to have any sort of sound in larger spaces or against orchestras. In short, soloists now needed a bow that would be able to accommodate these bigger pieces. Again, nothing was standardized at this point, but one of the more favored transitional bows, nicknamed the Kramer, after violinist Wilhelm Kramer, still had a clip-in frog, but the stick itself was longer and more concave instead of rounded. And what I mean by a clip-in frog was that the whole thing, the whole frog, would just pop out when you weren't using it, and you'd be left with this stick and hair ribbon. It kind of looks like an erhu bow, if you happen to know what that is. So once you took the frog and clipped it back in, it would cause the hairs to go taut. Now, Frant Tort is one of the biggest names in bow making, if not the biggest. Around the same time, he was using math to calculate the best proportions of the bow, something that might seem kind of obvious to a modern-day engineer, but was often thrown by the wayside in earlier times. So the bow was, again, lengthened. The proportions were more balanced by creating not only a heavier tip with more wood, but also by counterbalancing with a much heavier frog. His system for the winding mechanism is the one we use today, used to tighten the hair along the spreader block at the frog. This holds the hair taut while simultaneously preventing tangling. Tort also made the frog as it looks today, often highly ornamented and made with ebony, gold, and tortoiseshell, not to mention the mother-of-pearl underslide on the bottom that covers the mechanisms of the bow and the two inlaid eyes on either side of the frog. Basically, he made a bow with perfect balance, high response time, and that was extremely agile. This allowed for more variety in dynamics, exaggerations of sustained phrases, and new techniques that weren't possible on earlier bows like sautille and ricochet. The bow that Tort created has changed very little in all this time. Now, just a few more cool bits and bobs about the bow. Did you ever wonder why the bottom of the bow is called the frog? Now, my kids ask me this all the time because, of course, the frog looks nothing like a frog, and I never had an answer for them until I finally researched it. And it turns out the clue is in the name. So, as I mentioned before, early frogs were removable clip-in pieces that you could attach to the stick of the bow, and they were kind of V-shaped. And this piece came to be known as the frog not because of the animal, but, well, way back when horses were the main method of transport and an invaluable, very large part of everyday life, we were much more in tune with the animal itself. It turns out that on the bottom center of a horse's hoof, there is a tender spot shaped like a V. Sometime even farther back, somebody looked at that V shape and thought, hey, that kind of looks like a frog if you squint, and named that the frog. A few hundred years later, when the makers of the bow created this V-shaped clip-in innovation to hold the hair of a bow taut, they thought, hey, this kind of looks like the frog on a horse's hoof. Let's just call it the frog. And there you have the etymology of the frog. Incidentally, the same thought process was used in naming the railroad frog, the point at which two tracks meet and create a V. And this is also called a common crossing. I really love etymology. And last thing on bows, the word itself, bow. When encountering the word in a non-musical application, we often think of a bow and arrow. And well, that's exactly what the musical bow is derived from. The French word for bow is archer, and think of the English words we get from that, archery and archer. It's not a coincidence that early bows are so rounded. If you go further and further back into early bowed instruments, you'll find that these bows look very similar to just straight up bows. It's a rounded stick with sometimes hair or a piece of gut twine attached. The rebab, a very early Middle Eastern instrument, is known as the very first bowed instrument. And if you look at that bow, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. So if anyone is interested in learning a little bit more about the Baroque bow, check out this video that we did with a friend of ours, Evan Few, who is a violinist in the Filament Baroque Ensemble. Here he's showing one of his Baroque bows and one of the hacks he uses to tighten the hair with a clip-in frog on the end of the pin. So I'll put that link below as well. And I hope this video was informative, and if it was, make sure to drop a comment, give us a like, and subscribe. There will be one more video in this series, so stay tuned, and cheers!